Good Monday afternoon to you. Thank you for being with us here on Court TV Live. I'm your midday host, Julie Grant. We begin this morning where we just left off with a brand new trial this afternoon, the missing son murder trial. This is absolutely heartbreaking. The defendant is 49-year-old Dawan Ferguson. He's accused of first-degree murder for the death of his 9-year-old disabled son, Christian. Now, Christian's body has never been found, and Ferguson claims that back in 2003, he stopped at a payphone to make a phone call while he was on his way to taking his son to the hospital. Says that somebody carjacked him while he was on the phone and kidnapped his son. Now, the trial began this morning with the opening statements. Of course, the state goes first. They carry the burden. You haven't missed a minute. We hit the pause button in Ted Rowland's show. We're going to go back in now where we left off.
And so, Theda took some photos of him, and she took him to the hospital because she was afraid he was entering into one of those hyperammonemic states where the ammonia levels were starting to rise. So she's at the hospital. Christian's being seen by doctors, and her visitation time period ends. So Theda will tell you that she leaned in and gave Christian a kiss, said goodbye, without ever knowing that would be the last time she ever saw her little boy. March 22nd of 2003. We talked earlier about those life-sustaining medications that Christian's supposed to be receiving. You'll hear from someone who works at the Children's Hospital Pharmacy. You'll see those records. His medications were supposed to be supplied every 30 days. 30-day supply of these life-sustaining medications. They weren't filled every 30 days. You'll see that on several of them, it was 60 days, 70 days, 80 days. Some of them weren't filled for over 120 plus days. So we talked about how Theda didn't see Christian after March 22nd of that year. Dawan Ferguson did not bring Christian Ferguson to the next visit, or the next one, or the next one, or the ones after that. So Theda filed a motion in family court in St. Louis City to get these visitations to resume. It was scheduled to go to court on June 9th of 2003. June 9th. You will hear from Sharon Williams, Theda's sister. She will tell you that around Memorial Day, she had an interaction with the defendant. So she kind of acted as a go-between between the two. And on this day, at the end of May, she says that the defendant went to her house and was saying things to her like, "Can't you get Theda to drop this? Why do we need to go to court? Can't she just wait till the kids are older?" Things like that. But what she also remembers the defendant saying to her at the end of May is, "Theda will get those kids over my dead body." So let's jump forward to June 9th. That status conference took place, and the defendant was ordered to resume those visitations immediately or risk being held in contempt. 2 days later, on June 11th, is when Dawan Ferguson reported that his son Christian was the victim of this alleged carjacking. So let's talk a little bit about the events of June 11th, 2003. We talked earlier about how police, law enforcement, several agencies all got involved in an effort to look for Christian. It was broadcast over the news. Everyone was worried about a poor disabled little boy missing. I said earlier how the defendant drives right down here is the intersection of Page and Skinker. Right here is where the defendant lives. So from here to here. When the police respond to that intersection at Page and Skinker, the defendant tells them about how his son had been up all night vomiting and he was going to take him to the hospital. But he stopped to use a payphone along the way to call ahead. He reported that his expedition was last seen around 6:07 driving east into St. Louis City. I want to direct your attention to where the SUV was recovered. Up here, the top of that map, on a little dead-end street called Ronbar Lane. The expedition was found around 7:50 in the morning, a little less than 2 hours after he made that 911 call. It was found by law enforcement. But you will hear from the residents of that street. They saw that car there in the 5 o'clock hour, around 5 a.m. to 5:15 a.m., about an hour before the defendant made that 911 call. They already saw the expedition there. You'll see what this street looks like. You'll hear from these witnesses. For example, one of them, she will tell you that her boyfriend got up to go to work in the morning. He had to leave around 5 o'clock in the morning. Her bed goes straight up against her window. He leaves, and then she gets back into bed, and she sees headlights coming down. She thinks maybe he forgot something. Looks out. It's the defendant's car. You'll hear from the house that it was parked in front of. He saw it there before 6:07 as well. So as the defendant is claiming his car is being taken at 6:07 a.m., it's already been seen by 2 individuals on the street where it was abandoned. There's another address on that map, right here. Half a mile from Ronbar Lane is a little street called Disco Drive. And the defendant and his wife, Monica, had a friend that lived on Disco Drive. And she drove a tan Chevy Malibu. And she will come in and she will tell you that several people had keys to her car, would borrow it, use it, one of them being the defendant. So half a mile from Ronbar Lane, where the expedition was left, is where Lakeisha Mays lives with her tan Chevy Malibu. That Malibu is seen at the intersection of Page and Skinker, parked right around the corner from that payphone where the defendant made that 911 call. Let's talk a little bit about what you will hear in relation to what was occurring in the Ferguson household in the months leading up to, and specifically the night of the disappearance. You will hear from Lynn Ferguson, Christian's sister. She will tell you about what was going on in that house, how Christian wasn't being fed, he wasn't being bathed, he wasn't being cared for. She will tell you that when she was 8 years old, she would try to give him food. She would try to bathe him because no one else was. I may have forgot to mention this earlier, but we talked a lot about how March was important. The funding for the Medicaid for the at-home nurses ended in March of 2003. So from March of 2003 until June, no one was in that home caring for Christian. He wasn't being seen by doctors either. He wasn't being seen by his mother. He wasn't being shown to anyone. But Lynn Ferguson was living in that home. She saw Christian. She will say that he was getting skinnier and skinnier. And you could see the ribs on his body and his bones. I expect she might say that he looked like Gollum from Lord of the Rings. On the day of June 10th, Lynn notices that Christian's feeding tube is not in his stomach. and she saw a little bit of blood. She tells Monica that Christian's feeding tube is not in him. Monica doesn't care. And that night, Lynn was in her room. She shared with Christian. Christian is moaning loudly. She remembers seeing his eyes rolling into the back of his head and seeing the whites of his eyes. She remembers pretending to be asleep when the defendant walks into that bedroom, picks up Christian, and takes Christian into the TV room. She hears Christian moaning. She hears what she describes as a struggle, but she doesn't see it, but she hears it. And then she hears the moaning stop. And then she sees Dawan Ferguson carry a quiet Christian and place him back in bed. And then a short while later, he comes back in the room again, wraps him entirely in a blanket, and carries him out of the room. Lynn Ferguson never saw her brother again after that. Their stepsister, Deshonda, also lived in the home. She remembers that night too. She remembers getting up in the middle of the night, doesn't know why she's woken up, but gets up in the middle of the night. She expects it's around 3 or 4 in the morning. She goes to the restroom, and as she's leaving the restroom, she sees the defendant exiting from Christian's room, holding Christian, wrapped entirely in a blanket.
That poor child. So we're going to hit the pause button here. You're not going to miss a moment of the opening statements in the missing son murder trial. We'll be right back here on Court TV Live.
Free app now.
Shucks.
This is Court TV Live, your front row seat to justice. I'm Julie Grant. Thank you for being with us on this Monday. Let's go back in now and hear more of the opening statement from the prosecution in the state of Missouri in the case against Dawan Ferguson. It's his son who is the victim in this case, and we're hearing about him in this portion of the story being told in the open.
Including his own. She could not see any part of him, but knew it was him based on the size of the child. And she sees the defendant leave. All of that is in the middle of the night on June 10th, 2003. You will hear that after this 911 call was made and Christian was reported missing, there were several organized searches to try to find him. You will hear that the defendant did not participate in any of them. You will hear from members of the St. Louis City Police Department their extensive efforts in this case, how they called in assistance from the FBI. You will hear from members of the FBI that will testify here as well to their investigative work, the interviews they conducted, the evidence they seized. You will hear from Dr. Dorothy Grange, the geneticist here, Christian's geneticist, who will say that without immediate emergency hospital intervention, Christian Ferguson could not have survived, and that he would have died within 48 hours, of that reported disappearance. You will also hear from some other individuals that had conversations with the defendant. You will hear about a woman by the name of Ruth Todd, who knew the defendant and had at one point had a relationship with him. She calls the defendant, talks to the defendant, and asks about Christian. Said, "What happened?" And he tells her, "I did what I had to do." And when she asks, "What does that mean?" he just stares at her. You will hear from Lakeisha Mays, the individual whose Malibu he used. She called the defendant and asked, "Why'd you take my car?" And he says, "You don't need to talk to the police." And you will hear from a woman whose name is Santana Contreras. She worked with Monica, the defendant's then wife, at a store called The Avenue. She will tell you that she became friends with Monica and eventually went out with Monica and Dawan Ferguson, and that they had approached her about becoming involved in a three-way type relationship with them. And Monica eventually tells her a little bit about Christian. And then Dawan starts talking to her about Christian. And Christian Ferguson tells Miss Contreras things like, "That boy was dead before I ever reported him missing. The police would be ridiculous to believe a story like that. We weren't giving him his medication." He talks about his ex-wife Theda and how much he hated her. And he said that the police are never going to find that body. Over the next several days, you are going to hear a lot of evidence. You will hear from witnesses. You will hear from police officers, detectives, FBI agents, forensic interviewers, doctors, nurses. It's going to be a lot. Please stay focused and keep your eye on the ball. Don't get distracted by things that aren't important. Focus on the evidence, like we talked about in jury, the things the witnesses say, the physical pieces of evidence, stuff like that. It's going to be a lot, and we're asking a lot of you, but please stay focused. The defendant is charged in this case with murder in the first degree for knowingly causing the death of Christian Ferguson after deliberation. And he is also charged in the alternative with child abuse resulting in death by failing to provide Christian Ferguson with the necessary medication and nutrition that ultimately resulted in his death. And at the close of all of the evidence, I will ask that you find the defendant guilty of murder. Thank you.